right? You don't really know. You could do really well, but you could starve. As I talked about last time. So, what do? You're 1594, you're coming up on 30 years old, you're pretty bright, you're good with words, and you've been trying to make your way as a writer, which you're doing mostly, as people had to do mostly. There was almost no other way to do it, by trying to find a patron. I talked about that a little with the patron who maybe paid for some of the sonnets, or at least was flattered into thinking about the sonnets and possibly thinking about supporting Shakespeare out of those. You've also written two long poems, the kind of thing you would write to get a patron. Venus and Adonis, a love story, classical love, tragic love story, all laid out in beautiful poetry. Another one called The Rape of Lucrece, which we'll talk about next week, about another classical story, another classical tragic story. And you dedicated those around, but either the Earl of Southampton, Henry Risley, which is another Mr. W.H., some people think maybe that was it, and they switched the letters around, right? Either didn't offer him enough money, or Shakespeare got a little bored with it, but clearly at this moment, Shakespeare is having to make a decision about what he's going to do to make a living. And I think what he does is, he goes all in on trying to make a public theater work. Becoming a shareholder, a stockholder essentially in the company, working for the company, writing their plays, taking small roles in the plays. He doesn't know if it's going to work, but because all of a sudden what we see in 1593-4 is he writes Richard II, he writes Romeo and Juliet, he writes Midsummer Night's Dream, he's probably squeezing the part of Merchant of Venice in here. He's doing some pretty astonishing work for a couple of years here. Partly is some play closure, but mostly I think it's because he's decided he's going to throw himself into this and try to make it work, right? You probably know people, they got involved in some startup, they're working 98 hours a week, and they're either going to be billionaires or looking for something else. Well, I think Shakespeare was kind of about in that territory. Now, what happens, it seems to me, is that playing becomes an important thing in Elizabethan England. Theaters are becoming an important thing. There started to be a few plays. There's a play called The Spanish Tragedy that clearly was a big hit. And I think when we get to Hamlet, we'll see that Hamlet was actually kind of doing what they would do over in, the Fox studios. And they'd say, well, that was a big hit, write us one like that. And so Hamlet looks, as I mentioned, a fair amount like The Spanish Tragedy because the hero pretends to be crazy to keep the people from suspecting that he's cleverly plotting revenge. The other plays are around. There were certain ritual things in churches. There were little traveling companies that would go from town to town and put out the hat while they did their performance on little wooden platforms they would drag with them and set up. You get that kind of thing in Midsummer Night's Dream, since it seemed like a number of you have seen or read that, with the rude mechanicals who put on a little play for the wedding, and we'll look at that one starting a week from today. No, we won't. A week from Tuesday. So that doesn't seem to be quite enough for him to count on. So when Shakespeare starts becoming this playwright, he's not really starting completely from scratch, even though playwriting in particular was not a huge business at that time. Because it being the Renaissance, there's a lot of recovery of a lot of classical texts from long ago. So we have to get back in the time machine, go back another 2,000 years or so, and we're in a moment where, the ancient, I don't know what, Trevor Noahs and Stephen Colbert's were sort of losing some of their audience because people weren't really into all this nasty, cynical commentary on the political scene anymore, which was what was called the old comedy, continued to be called the old comedy. They started having this other mode of play, which was called new comedy. It's pretty old by now, but new comedy, looks like you're aware of these terms. New comedy was a certain kind of plot that's probably in some ways familiar to you. It's almost always a young woman, and there's a young man that she is suitably in love with and is in love with her, but they're not being allowed to marry. Instead, the young woman is being forced to marry some rich old fogey miser to get more money for the family, and her father, using his authority and the power of the law, is forcing her to marry the bad guy. Fortunately, the family has a clever servant, sometimes a wily enslaved person. One of the main inventors of this form Shakespeare imitated was a man named Terence in classical Rome. Terence himself had been a slave, had been enslaved, and had gradually gained his freedom and became very famous as a playwright. In any case, Shakespeare picks up on this formula. And it seems to me that in Shakespeare's comedies, you see this formula work out a lot. It's going to be really clear in Midsummer Night's Dream. But there are many versions. The first scene of Midsummer Night's Dream really already lays it out, and the rest of the play sort of spills off from there. But Shakespeare doesn't ever let generic forms quite be what, he doesn't let them leave his pen the way they arrived at his brain, the way they arrived at his eyes and his ears. Instead, he does something kind of weird to them. You may be wondering why I'm spending so much time talking about comedy as a genre when, in fact, we're looking at a play that pretty clearly announces itself as the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. And I think that the reason I'm talking about comedy, usually a play that ends in marriage with the implication of procreation to provide an ongoing life for people, instead of tragedy, which tends to be a story that ends in the death of the central character, is because it seems to me that Romeo and Juliet is a lot like a comedy that somehow ends up being a tragedy. It feels like you're getting all these signals that are telling you that this play is going to be a comedy. And sometimes, like when the moon is full, which I think was the night before last, I think it's actually the other way around. This is actually a comedy that's disguised as a tragedy. That there is some reason to think there is some kind of miraculous element of renewal that actually survives what's ostensibly the tragic ending of the play. And I want to show you what I think Shakespeare accomplishes by creating confusion about that. So certainly one thing he accomplishes is that he makes the ending of the play a little more emotionally disturbing because it's a lot less expected. If you're just going to the play and you see the formula of comedy playing itself out, you're not really ready for it. On the other hand, you kind of know from the beginning, right, that that's what's going to be going on because it says outside the theater the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. And in fact, the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, so you kind of know what you're up against. And if that weren't enough to convince you, what does the opening chorus of the play say? Oh, very sad, terrible, these poor kids, they're going to die. Essentially, right? Because the families hated each other, what a waste. And that's pretty much the story you get if you read Shakespeare's main sources, particularly a poem by a guy named Arthur Brooke. Certainly main source, a poem called Romeus and Juliet. So that's not the brain injury. Romeus is the name of that character in the play. All right, so maybe Shakespeare gives away the whole story there at the beginning. And I think maybe that's why, I don't know how many of you experience it this way, but you watch the play usually and you just feel like maybe this is going to work, right? You're kind of on the edge of your seats. There's this, and this message can get through, but here comes Romeo in a minute, and she's going to wait for a moment it could possibly. There's this whole sort of, desperate, tense, second-to-second crisis that just then kind of melts away into this blank eternity at the end with just a sort of a meaningless ceremony of memorial on the part of the now reconciled families. So you think this is going to work out, and Shakespeare is giving us things that would tell you that it's going to be a comedy. There's all those bawdy jokes, all the low-life characters making their sex jokes. That kind of stuff belongs, certainly Aristotle would have told people in this period, does not belong in a great tragedy. But great artists tend to work against conventions, or work against the conventions that are given to them, right? Exciting stuff's going to happen. There's a Schoenberg Hall over here. Why? What did Mr. Schoenberg do that was surprising? Anybody know? 12-tone music, right? He says, what if we shift the whole musical scale and compose within that? What's going to happen? Stravinsky getting, the ballet of Swan Lake, jeered off the stage. Stravinsky. Or, French Impressionists getting themselves thrown out of all the art exhibits in Paris because they're doing this thing. Bob Dylan, Newport Folk Festival, 1964, something like that, right? Getting booed off the stage because he plugs in his electric band at one point and is no longer the hero of folk protest scene. So, there's a certain rankling. Artists are creative people. They're sort of an investment, I think, in some evolutionary sense in what we need as a species, which is every once in a while somebody to say, hey, let's look at things differently, instead of all getting complacent in the ways we conceive. So, people like formulas. Right, this is what, certainly me, in my era of growing up watching television, you sort of know what's going to happen, right? You've got a detective story, what's going to happen? The beginning, there's some ominous music, and somebody gets killed in some dark, shadowy way, and the story begins to play itself out, and the detective begins to get some progress, but then somehow, the evil bureaucrat boss tells him to leave it alone, but he goes off on his own to figure it out, and terrible chase, and then there's usually a young woman in terrible peril, and then at the last minute they somehow solve it and save it, and then you have a little scene in the office where they're all jeering with each other, sort of bro-like, and kidding around about how great it was, and we did it, and then we're done, right? And you want the formula to play itself out. And certainly if you have little brothers or little sisters you read stories to, they don't really like you to change anything, right? Because it's soothing, it's something that you need to feel calmed down. But I think there are times where artists really need to tell us to wake up instead. So, in that formal sense, Romeo and Juliet's a tragedy, right? Not really that hard to prove. You start off in a diseased, overheated city where there are these irreconcilable conflicts going on. You have the pair of young lovers who are being prevented from being with each other, and the young woman is going to be forced to marry off to this aristocratic Count Paris, who her parents assume is perfect. And you have, I think, a version of the wily servant in the form of Friar Lawrence, right? Who's going to behind the scenes and come up with a clever plan and do this. And, so that's all really within the main line of the genre. And meanwhile, the lovers get plunged into the passions, the darkness, the lostness, the seeming death. And Shakespeare toys with that again in a play called Much Ado About Nothing. Death, identities are lost out in the confusion, as we'll see in the forest in Midsummer Night's Dream. All that's the stuff that happens. Now, Romeo's trying to shed his name. Juliet's essentially leaving her family and the life. Everybody is trying to escape from the identities, but it's dark, it's dangerous, there's confusion, there's mix-ups, and usually in a comedy, then somehow, miraculously, the juggling act all gets put together. But I think at the moment, the beginning of the fifth act, where Romeo says, you know what, I'm not going to take poison here, I'm going to go and take my poison in Juliet's tomb instead. Don't you kind of think, oh, right, that's what's going to happen. He's going to go there, because he set us up with saying, oh, I'm going to poison up. No, wait, I'm going to wait and do it there. And she will wake up, and they'll have their grand reunion, and they'll run off happily together. I think that's what's supposed to happen. But then the weirdest thing happens, or the weirdest thing doesn't happen, which is that the pardon from the governor comes to the execution chamber 38 seconds too late. And all of a sudden, there's really nothing that anybody can do meaningfully to save the situation. So we have another comic mode in the way that often in these plays, and I know this is very heteronormative, in these plays, there's a struggle, both for young men to decide to sort of leave behind their, friends in their bunch of rowdy guys together, right? And all supporting each other and making fun of anybody who gets too sentimental or any of that stuff the way Mercutio does to Romeo. And that person has to figure out a way to leave it behind and actually say, I'm going to devote myself to this young woman. Conversely, you have the young women who are also having to break away from their confidential friends. There's a great deal in Shakespeare about these sort of moments of, we'll see this with Hermia and Helena in Midsummer Night's Dream, of young women who've grown up and trusted each other, been intimate with each other, and then have to figure out how to go and do this other, more terrifying thing, which is a certain, heterosexual sexual love, essentially. Everybody's got fears and anxieties, according to these stories, that have to be played out that way. And I think it's really hard to imagine a situation in which you do get the comic ending and then get the rest of these people's lives, right? I mean, what happens? There's actually a wonderful poem, I should bring it in, a woman named Maxine Cumin, really good poet, has one that's just sort of telling the story of Romeo and Juliet after Julia wakes up in time and they run off together and they're having just to live as a couple in Mantua, and they got some babies, another baby coming, and the other one's still in diapers, and they're screaming and crying. Every once in a while, there's a letter that comes back from Verona from Grandma setting some booties, but the last line of the poem is, "The fifth act runs unconscionably long." And back in Verona, they're still fighting with each other. And I want to say, marriage gets a bad rap in this play, in that poem, in a lot of stuff. I mean, I sort of grew up on, I don't know what, Sondheim musicals and Carly Simon song things. Just think, really great. Really great. I've been married now 34 years. You get somebody that, you trust each other, they help you. You help them, you know the same things together. You know if you don't agree about something, that the other person is at least half the time right about it. Somebody worth being at your best for, right? Somebody, it doesn't mean you have to be perfect all the time, but it means it's worth it because somebody notices what's good about you and keeps on noticing it. So anyway, just a little public interest announcement there. It can be hard. You have to just sort of find heart of gold and all that, but anyway. All right, so leaving that behind. If we're deceived in one level into thinking that, wait, one more thing. This is some of what Shakespeare does. Shakespeare takes ordinary situations that happen commonly to lots and lots of people, and he figures out some way to blow them up to a grand dramatic scale with a lot at stake, a lot of passion, intensity, all of those things, so that we can kind of identify with them even if we don't have that experience on the same scale. He's visiting certain kinds of common psychological moments and interpersonal conflicts that are very lasting across the range of recorded human history. Obviously, there are two ways to look at the world, right? You can be a kind of, what's the term? We can be a continualist or a separatist. You can sort of do Michel Foucault stuff and say, there's this episteme and you can't understand their reality when you're in this episteme. And another way says there's continuity. And my reflex is for continuity. I think part of what I was trying to talk about last time, and I'm going to talk about probably fairly often in the course, is how much Shakespeare turns out to be somebody who really is close to us, even though thousands of miles apart and hundreds of years away. So, having just said that, if on one level we're being tempted into thinking this love's going to succeed, in other ways we're absolutely being told that it's bound to burn itself out, that love this great and intense is never going to be able to survive. It's what the opening chorus calls death-marked love. So you already kind of know. And you get a problem, a version of that problem played out and explicated in a way for us that first night out in the moonlight of the Capulet estate, where Juliet says she wishes Romeo hadn't heard her give her speech about how much she's in love with Romeo. She wishes she could take it back. Everyone says, why do you want to take it back? And she says, just so I could give it to you again, right? What is this first moment where miraculously, unbelievably, when you've given up on it maybe in a way, love turns out to happen, right? It turns out, and it certainly is remarkable to think about exactly what that moment is like. But there's a danger that that moment is then gone. It remains gone pretty much forever. You can't get back at it. So maybe what Romeo and Juliet, the play, is offering to us is a choice between one kind of love and life that's intense, passionate, and essentially likely to blow itself up very soon, and a more realistic, practical way of living that doesn't have the destructiveness of that, but also doesn't have the magnificence of that kind of grand investment. So, I mean, this is a play obviously where young people first meet Shakespeare, right? It sounds like that was true for a lot of you. But I also think it's a place where Shakespeare reminds teachers how far they are from adolescent students, because you can sort of just tell how you'd have to think and act longer if you wanted to live longer just by listening to the nurse, right? Telling Julia, what should Julia tell Julia about marrying Paris once Romeo's gone? Go ahead. He's a good guy, you know, he's got some money, he's nice, he's handsome, doesn't really matter in bed, bodies are more or less the same, right? You know, and it's a plausible enough answer. And Julia, you know, she's not going to buy it, but that's, you know, that's the nurse's perspective. Or think of Friar Lawrence, who not only has all these kinds of balancing acts he's trying to do to keep everything moderate, you know, love moderately, he says, in fact, specifically, right? Long love does so, too swift arrives as something as fatal as too slow, something that's too slow. And of course, look at Friar Lawrence at the end of the play. What does he do? He's down there, comes into the tomb. Oh my God, Juliet, you're awake? Romeo's dead. Oh my God, what am I going to do? Oh, I hear the guards coming. Run! And he runs away. You know, run away to live another day. It's not the most romantic performance on the part of the nurse or the friar, but they're the people who are, you know, alive at the end of the play. So how do you decide to measure that trade-off? Juliet seems to be the wiser of these two lovers, I think. And even in that first exchange, she sees the dangers of just plunging into erotic love headlong, right? She says, although I joy in thee, I have no joy of this contract tonight. It is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden. And she says, too like the lightning that does cease to be, ere we can say, it lightens, right? You know, lightning, it's there and gone for you. Oh, look, lightning. Doesn't work, right? I had this a few nights ago, didn't we get? Well, it was one big flash of lightning, and then it was gone, right? You couldn't say, hey, everybody look at the light, right? So she senses that danger, and the friar tries to reinforce it. The friar says, wisely and slow, they stumble that run fast. And in fact, we sort of get a play taking off from that when they're waiting for Juliet to arrive for the wedding. And this is passage number 1 on your handout. Anybody need a handout? And you know, the friar is trying to talk to them and warn them, explain to them this and that, and say, you know, the friar says, you know, we want to do this so that after hours with sorrow chide us not, right? So we don't later regret. Right? Spend a ridiculous amount of my time trying to avoid doing something I'm going to regret later. It's not the most heroic mode of life. So Romeo listens to this, and then Romeo says, amen, amen. I think he says something like that. Yeah. But come what sorrow can, I cannot countervail the exchange of joy that one short minute gives me in her sight. Do thou but close our hands with holy words, then love-devouring death, do what he dare. It is enough I may but call her mine. But the friar number 2 on your handout has the answer. These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die, like fire and powder, that's gunpowder, like fire and powder, which as they kiss, consume. Right? Therefore love moderate. And in fact, you're going to get a series of images coming back in the play about this sort of burst of light, this explosion. Romeo's going to talk about wanting to get a poison that will destroy him as fast as gunpowder does out of the barrel of a gun. And there's a couple of lightning references that I think come through Juliet later on. And that's how the play runs. Too swift arrives as unhappily as too slow does. I mean, if Romeo had gotten there a little bit slower, it would have been fine, right? Just needed to be a little bit slower, and a little slower maybe to make his fatal decision. So how do you figure out sort of where we measure the kind of amplitude of life, the acceleration of time, and certain elements of stability that human beings need? You're going to get this explosion, this fire between the two of them. And the question is, what do we make of that spectacle. They have their first conjugal kiss, Romeo and Juliet's, inevitably, rapidly propels them toward the embrace of death down in the tomb together. The marriage vow doubles as a suicide pact. Or to put it another way, when the passions that run comedy come in too strong and too intense a form, they can actually create tragedy. Right? I think that there's a fair amount of evidence for that in the play and in life. So the friar says, at the beginning of Act 2, Scene 3, that this, the same dosage of this plant can be medicine for people, or it will kill you if you take too much of it. This is number 3 on your handout. Oh, mickle, that's great. Oh, mickle is the powerful grace that lies in plants, herbs, stones, and their true qualities. For naught knows nothing. Not so vile that on the earth doth live, but to the earth some special good doth give. Nor aught so good, but strained from that fair use, revolts from true birth, stumbling on abuse. And he adds, 2 such opposed kings encamp them still in men as well as herbs, right? You have this potential, if it carries too far, if you do it too fast, too assertively, too unguardedly, then you fall into a world of extraordinary danger. So, and they're certainly set up from the very beginning of the play, all of those familiar puns and jokes about killing, about cutting off the maiden's head, the men's heads, and the maiden heads. All these kind of jokes that get talked about commonly in commentaries on the play as things that were put in there for the groundlings, that is, the people who paid the cheapest seats, which aren't seats, standing room seats. They pay a half penny, and they stand there, and they're uneducated and illiterate and drunk, and all they want is some dirty jokes to get them through the thing. But Shakespeare being Shakespeare, he takes something that maybe he feels he has to do for his audience, and ends up figuring out a way to make it meaningful in the play. So all the mixture of the kind of violence with the erotics in this play is reinforcing the kind of message that I've been talking about, a message about what love and death might have to do with. So the nurse complains. This is also seen, and particularly in the performance videos, and I've got a couple. Did the Romeo and Juliet movies come up on your? They should have come up today, available for you. The Zeffirelli and the Baz Luhrmann movie, if you want to watch either of those, should be up in the media on the media gallery. All right, I'll figure out what module it is, but you can find it. And I have various plays coming up that'll be on that later on. But it's usually performed that Mercutio and the other guys are attacking the nurse and lifting up her skirt. And there's a series of jokes of that. She's got this servant named Peter, which is already kind of a dirty joke. And she says, you would stand by and let these men use me at their pleasure. And he says, if I'd seen anyone use you at his pleasure, my weapon should surely have been out, and all this stuff. So it's there like that, but it's important in a play where we're trying to figure out what violence or violent death has to do with erotic desire. And you remember use from Sonnet 20, women's use, men use me at their pleasure, and so on. So every time that poor Count Paris talks to Lord Capulet about his desire to marry Juliet, they end up talking about death instead. Right? Or Lord Capulet says, earth has swallowed all my hopes but she. In other words, his other children have all died, and then eventually it comes in metaphorically, and then it becomes a reality when Paris shows up for the wedding, only to discover that Juliet has died, and at least supposedly has died. Even the chorus at the beginning of the second act of the play uses some ominous metaphors to talk about what's going on between Romeo and Juliet. The chorus says, "Now old desire doth in his deathbed lie, and young affection gapes to be his heir." It's not a romantic or at least an anti-mortalist way of looking at that. And in fact, 2 scenes later, Friar Lawrence has something like that to say again, because Romeo comes to him and says, hey, I'm madly in love, I'm going to get married. And Friar kind of says, what? Slow down. Says, hey, you got to marry me, Juliet. And she says, who's Juliet? Weren't you in love with Rosalind? And Romeo says, well, you told me to marry love. And the friar says, yeah, but not like a grave. Put one in, another out to that is functioning like graveyards, as we'll see in Hamlet did in the Renaissance. I mean, there wasn't a lot of room. You'd bury the bodies so they wouldn't spread disease and stink. But once they had enough chance to be decayed and eaten up by the worms, you dig up the bones. The bones are useful for various things. And then you bury somebody else in the grave. Just kind of go on a rotation with it, right? This is just kind of how it was happened. And so the friar's saying, as if this sort of cradle robbing were a form of grave robbing. But it's a weird metaphor for him to apply to Romeo saying, oh, I'm not in love with that person anymore. Now I'm in love with Juliet. And in fact, as soon as Romeo has his very first moments of falling in love with Juliet and expressing his love for Juliet, death kind of enters. Because the very next thing is Tybalt, right, number 4 on your handout, stepping out maybe behind one of those pillars on the stage like that. It was a big open stage, but there were 2 support pillars holding up a roof with probably had inlaid stars, constellations up there. But he steps out as Romeo and Juliet have begun their first romantic conversation and says, number 4, this by his voice should be a Montague. Fetch me my rapier. What? Here's the slave, come hither, covered with an antic face. There's antic again, remember we talked about that? A funny costume mask. Come hither, covered with an antic face, to fleer and scorn at our solemnity. Now, by the stock and honor of my kin, to strike him dead, I hold it not a sin. So, their love is provoking their murder, the murder of Romeo, at least, from the very first instance that it begins to form. I don't think that could possibly be an accident. The love, in fact, is the thing that is provoking Tybalt to threaten death. And Tybalt and Romeo soon meet again. And again, I think it's a tragic meeting of love and death. Because what happens between Tybalt and Romeo? Yeah? Yes.
Okay. Tybalt kills Mercutio, and then Romeo was trying to be calm and nice at first and trying to stop the fight because of his love for Juliet. But then in the end, he ends up getting revenge and killing Tybalt.
Good. Okay. So, that's how that scene is playing out. And Romeo, is trying to smooth it over, right? Because he now thinks, I need to reconcile. I don't want to be in any kind of fight with the Capulets now because I'm in love with Juliet and she's in love with me and everything. We have to make this work. And so when Tybalt insults him, he just keeps kind of deflecting it back. He says, Tybalt, the reason I have to love thee doth much excuse the appertaining rage to such a greeting. Right? Oh no, look, I really love you guys. And it's as if you can watch Romeo saying, trying to steer these, violent, tragic passions back into this love story. I really want to keep it within the love story. And there is something potentially comic about Tybalt, who's trying to figure out how to pick a fight with somebody who just kind of keeps blowing kisses at him and saying really sweet things about him and his family. But unfortunately, comic in this play, love in this play, always leads to tragedy, leads to death. Because within that fight, remember, how does Mercutio say he gets stabbed? Why wasn't he able to defend himself? Yes?
It was under Romeo's arm.
Okay, so presumably what happens is, right, Romeo is doing one of those hold me back things you see from, fake baseball brawls, and so he's holding him, right, no, like this, and he's defenseless, the sword comes in here, and he can't protect himself, so the embrace, right, Romeo's love embrace, again, becomes the thing that actually causes the death, that then causes all the other ones. Love and death are just wildly entangled with each other, all through the play, not just at the very end of it. All right. So, it seems to me we get another instance of this on the morning after Romeo and Juliet have their wedding night. Why? What's the situation? They've had their first night together. It's dawn. What's going on? Yeah.
Romeo's been banished.
Romeo's been banished. If he is found inside Verona's walls the next day, he will be put to death. So, and Juliet says, oh, stay, I love you. And he says, I really love you, but... yeah, we'll get into that conversation probably next time. But But so, you see what I mean? If his love keeps him there, and their love for each other makes him stay, it's also going to make him dead. So it's another place where Shakespeare says, look, love and death, you just can't pull them apart in this particular tragic universe I'm creating here. And eventually, of course, remember, Juliet tries to kissing Romeo, wants to kiss Romeo so she can get maybe enough of the poison that he just took to die herself. Again, pretty, once you start seeing this stuff, right, it is everywhere. Their conjugal kiss, their last conjugal kiss is itself really a commitment to death that is not separable even from the kiss itself. So, even before this stuff blows up to this degree, when they're talking to Friar Lawrence, each one of them picks up on a kind of ambiguous comment and thinks that the other one maybe is dead, is what that means. So it's almost like they really want their love to be something that isn't going to last because they don't want to see it ever fade away. You want to be able to maintain something like the perfection of that moment that's made this place so alluring for such a long time. However, well, actually, maybe the best example occurs shortly after this, after their wedding night, when Juliet's mother is talking to Juliet about essentially what has happened and about what ought to happen to Romeo. So passage number 5 on your handout here. What Juliet, I think, does amazingly is find a way to use her cleverness and her command of language. She's a very sharp person. To find a way that she can talk to her mother so her mother thinks what her mother already thinks and wants to think. Namely, why is Juliet crying? Because her cousin Tybalt's dead, right? That awful Romeo killed him, so you're just miserable, and Romeo, terrible, right? So she wants to be able to satisfy her mother by saying that, but she can't bring herself to exactly say that she wants Romeo dead, right? She wants to find a way to talk about him that actually still affirms her love for him. And it's an amazing piece of tightrope walking, and I think it's only possible because the line between love wishing and death wishing in this play is so tiny and blurry sometimes. So, look at number 5. Juliet says, God pardon him, that is, Romeo. God pardon him, I do with all my heart, and yet no man like he doth grieve my heart. Meaning, what her mother wants it to mean and then assumes it does mean. That is because the traitor murderer lives, says the mother. Juliet's answer, Aye, madam, from the reach of these my hands, would none but I might venge my cousin's death. Right, so what's she really saying and what's she want her mother to think she's saying? She's really saying, she wants her mother to think she's saying, oh, I wish I could strangle him myself, right? That's what I really would like to be able to do. That'd be satisfying. But she also is saying, yeah, it's killing me that I can't get my hands on Romeo. And I hope nobody other than me is going to do him any harm, because I'm certainly never going to do him any harm. And she then continues, if you flip over the page, Indeed, I never shall be satisfied with Romeo till I behold him dead. Is my poor heart so for a kinsman vexed? You feel the little seesaw tilt there in the middle of the sentence. Oh, how my heart abhors to hear him named. That's Romeo. Oh, my heart abhors to hear him named, and cannot come to him to wreak the love I bore my cousin upon his body that hath slaughtered him. I really, again, it's a passionate erotic statement really about Romeo and what love, all the kinds of love that she intends to give him, love of kin as well as love of couple. But at the same time, it covers perfectly her tracks in the eyes of her mother. So, I think we have to respect Juliet for that, but have to realize again that it's making it so difficult to pull apart these supposed tragic and comic threads. Shakespeare also keeps reminding us that Juliet's marriage, or marriages, will be marriage to death, essentially. So Romeo and Juliet spend 2 nights together. Where are they? One's the wedding night, right, in Juliet's chamber. The other's in the Capulet family tomb, where they remain dead. The first time Juliet sees Romeo, she says to the nurse, "If he be married, my grave is like to prove my wedding bed," right? If that guy is not eligible to me, then I'm never going to marry anybody, because that's the only one for me. I will be in my grave without having had a husband. And when Romeo is banished, Juliet says this again in another way: "I'll to my wedding bed, and death, not Romeo, take my maiden head." I know, right? It's sort of exhausting, but you see how thoroughly Shakespeare's weaving all this stuff together. And when she refuses to marry Count Paris, her mother says, "I would the fool were married to her grave." Another image, and I think I'm going to talk more about this again on Tuesday, but I think Shakespeare is playing pretty persistently on a pretty famous mythological story. Probably actually more than one. But who was married to the Lord of Death in the underworld? Persephone, Proserpina Persephone, right? How does that happen? He takes her, right? He kidnaps her, comes up, drags her down to the underworld. And I want to wrestle a little bit with that because it's definitely an illusion. One of the things, I talked about Shakespeare writing classical stuff, but again, Shakespeare's audiences had a much narrower range of cultural icons, cultural references that were common. I can still get away with the occasional, Harry Potter remark or something, but other than that, how many things has everybody kind of seen or heard the way they had all known their Greek and Roman mythology, the way they all know their Bible? So, in that story of Hades performing this kidnapping and essentially rape, Persephone, Proserpina, what's her situation thereafter? Remember? She's stuck. Why is she stuck? Well, she's stuck because she ate, there are different versions of it, but she ate like a certain number of pomegranate seeds. And so for at least that number of months in the year, she has to stay underground. This is all the kind of seasonal myth, you see, right? That's the winter. And then life comes back. Her mother is Demeter, mother of the goddess of agriculture. And so she has this period, and then every once in a while, every year she can briefly come up into the world again. And one of the things I want to try to argue today is that there's that possibility in some sense for Juliet also, that the story of her tragically being drawn into death is also a story in some ways of the possibility of renewal. So, and in fact she even says to the friar, I would rather be buried in the mausoleum, with the dead stinking bones of my ancestors than to marry Count Paris. And essentially Friar Lawrence says, hey, that's actually a good idea, right? Let's get you down in there, and then we can figure something out. But up top, they don't really know what's going on, and Lord Capulet has to say to Paris, this is number 6 on your handout, "Oh, son, the night before thy wedding day hath death lain with thy wife. There she lies, flower she was, deflowered by him. Death is my son-in-law, death my heir," and so on. That's how we do the time. Interruption. I said we could either, I kind of like to just keep going, but if people feel you need a break, we could get out a bit early if you do that, but if you'd rather have like a 10-minute break, we can take a 10-minute break. Can I ask just for a show of hands, how many people would rather just keep going for the next however much? And how many people would rather take a break? Okay, so thank you. So we'll just keep going. You don't have to do this every time, but we'll probably do it. But again, if you need to leave, use the bathroom, get a cup of coffee so you don't fall asleep, whatever it is, that's fine, right? I'm not going to take a little offense, but I will get over it, okay? Right. Okay, so, and Juliet comes across this same scene in the tomb. This is number 7 on your handout, where he looks at Juliet, right? And what looks peculiar about Juliet to him? Yeah, she doesn't, she still has good color. She looks pretty good. She's doesn't seem to have any heartbeat or any breathing or anything like that, but she looks like she's alive. And he looks at her and says, shall I believe, he looks at her and says, shall I believe that unsubstantial death is amorous, and that the lean, abhorrent monster keeps thee here in dark to be his paramour? So this is reinforcing, right, the Hades story, but it's also part of the sort of psychology, and it's also setting up another moment where you want to grab the people up on the stage and say, wait a minute, you really want to give this a chance. But it does keep on the question of marriage to death and what that means in the context of all the ways we like to think separately about marriage and like death. Shakespeare, I think, is playing on the mythological background. He's playing on some of the sort of necrophiliac tendencies in the period. There's a lot of great tragedies. For example, like the Duchess of Malfi, where people are tricked into, or the Revenger's tragedy, tricked into kissing the skull of something that has poison on its lips, or they're given the hand of their beloved from whom they've been separated only to discover it's no longer attached to a living body. There's a lot of sort of gruesome stuff like that. But I think Shakespeare is finding ways to explore a certain set of meaningful binaries that people think in, and maybe trying to offer some ways to think your way back out of them. So, Romeo and Juliet are choosing a passion they instinctively know and other people around them suspect is linked to death. It's an insanely costly romance. The question is, do we prefer practicality to romance? And I think in the very first scene where Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare is setting a lot of stuff up, we get the choice laid out for us pretty clearly. As the young people are all meeting each other and sort of debutante-ish kind of thing, and being introduced to society and dancing their elegant dances together in the candlelight with the wine, and very romantic situation. But Lord Capulet and some relative of his sort of give us a commentary from the old people's perspective on this whole scene that's very de-romanticizing. So number 8 on your handout. Lord Capulet, I'm going to talk a lot about Lord Capulet on Tuesday, believe it or not. Says, welcome, gentlemen. Ladies that have their toes unplagued with corns will walk about with you. It's not exactly a romantic thing about, oh, and by the way, a lot of women don't want to dance because they've got this nasty stuff growing on their feet. I have seen a day that I have worn a visor, and could tell a whispering tale in a fair lady's ear, such as would please. 'Tis gone, 'tis gone, 'tis gone. Nay, sit, good cousin Capulet, for you and I are past our dancing days. How long is now since last yourself and I were in a mask? And his cousin says, by a lady, 30 years. Lord Capulet's a little shocked by that. This happens as you get older. You think something, wow, that was 20 years ago, and it turns out it was 30 or 40. What, man, says Lord Capulet. 'Tis not so much, 'tis not so much. 'Tis since the nuptial of Lucentio come Pentecost as quickly as it will, done 25 years, and then we masked. Capulet, cousin, says, 'Tis more, 'tis more. His son is elder, sir. His son is 30. This is a scary thing. I've seen this already. Like I watch TV and I say, hey, wait a minute, I know that name. He must be the son of that guy who played third base for the Dodgers. And then they say, and that's the grandson of so-and-so. All right, okay. Part of the fun of watching sports, though, is that people come up and they grow up and then they go away, and you feel like a god. You're sort of watching over generation after generation of the world moving by. I don't know. And then you speed it up again by watching only Sports Center. So that's how life goes. All right. So you get this feeling that the old people, and they sort of are, they know, they half know, they don't want to believe it, that that part of their lives is over, but it is, and there's a lot in this play that just kind of weighs in on this, and you're listening to the conversations, and you were all just probably home for holiday events, two old relatives bickering with each other over the exact details of when something happened between two distant relatives of yours that you have no interest in whatsoever. That ever happened? Yes, right? It's sort of there. There's a moment like this in Henry IV that maybe we'll get to see when we get to that play. I think it's in part 2. Don't end it. Anyway, one of the things that happen is we're reminded that these kinds of passionate expressions of both love and violence pretty much are a province of youth. We get to see who? Lady Capulet and Lady Montague telling their husbands who want to get out and join in the brawl that's going on in the street, right? That they are better suited to walking around, with a cane than with a sword. They make fun of these people, and they understandably make fun of them because age is an important fact. In fact, 1936, there was a big budget movie that I elected not to put on the course website because I don't think it works, but it's a reminder these are young people. There's a court case going on now, isn't there, about how young the actors were in the Zeffirelli movie. Because they're suing for, in this big budget Hollywood version of it, it cast Leslie Howard, terrific actor, Norma Shearer, terrific actor, both big movie stars at the time as the title characters. But at the creaky old ages of 43 and 34, it just didn't really look right. I mean, this kind of talk that you have in your own joint, it's gorgeous, but if you listen to several people several decades older, wouldn't you find it kind of treacly and a little bit off-putting? I don't know. I think you end up excusing a lot of the stupid stuff they do because they're young, and there's something that's magnificent about this explosion of their passions that they themselves don't even know how to put into perspective. So, there's another version, by the way, another aspect of this, that the young, crazy Tybalt and Mercutio were played by Basil Rathbone, who played Sherlock Holmes in a lot of movies. Didn't you see Enola Holmes? Just watched that last night, the first one. Anyway, Sherlock Holmes, he's now in his mid-40s, right? That's the leader of the enemy gang Tybalt. And John Barrymore, who was in his 50s, was the wild child Mercutio. Just doesn't work, right? So I think that, it's interesting to think about what this play has to say about generations as well as what it has to say about the relationship between love and death. So Zeffirelli makes his actors very young, very pretty, very kind of lovely, because I think Shakespeare wants to suggest that neither the intense love nor the intense hate that run these things, but especially certain intensities of erotic passion, really tend to be able to resist the erosion of long-time daily experience. The injuries that prevent the old men from fighting, the horns on the toes that prevent the women from dancing, all the arguments about family affairs, about how to bring up your children that are clearly sort of going on between Lord Capulet and Lady Capulet, and poor, Lord Montague worrying about his kid, all this stuff that as it eventually tends to wear away the ability to have a certain kind of easy, youthful fondness to each other and attraction to each other. You probably read English 10A, right, to his coy mistress, Andrew Marvell, talking about, let us at once our time devour, then languish in his slow-chapped power. In other words, saying, let's just tear each other apart instead of languishing. And slow-chapped means chaps were like gums, lips, and they sort of got no teeth anymore, and you kind of get gummed to death by love, right? That's not good, right? We want something that's got a little more intensity than that. So you get Juliet's nurse, right? She's babbling on about, disasters as small as a little kid bumping her head, though we'll talk again about that, and as grand as earthquakes. And all of it's just kind of contained in this sort of jumbled story of a life and some pretty, unexamined premises of what matters in the world. You can ask yourself, I think, why does he go out of the way to show us servants having to do all this messy little business of setting things up, of sending out invitations to the party and getting them to the right people, of the fact that the cook is screaming in the kitchen while they're trying to get ready for this party. You could sort of see the ghost of Karl Marx drift into the room for a little bit here, right? I mean, Shakespeare, he could choose to leave that out, and Zeffirelli leaves it out. There's really not much of that stuff there because he wants to keep that, warm aura, sort of soft focus aura on the love screen. But Shakespeare puts it in, and he doesn't have to put it in. There's a whole supporting cast that make possible this love story. And Shakespeare, you know, man of the practical theater, had to decide if he wanted you to have to think about it. And I don't mean that you necessarily turn the play into a kind of, you know, critique of the romantic loves and indulgence of the bourgeoisie, but there is a way that Shakespeare keeps inviting us to see the difference between a kind of indulgent romance of people who have a certain kind of privilege and freedom and the burdens that other people have to bear. So I put here on the handout, under number 9, what I think is a nice condensed instance of this. The nurse is sending Juliet off to Friar Lawrence's to get married, right? Everything's been worked out now, and then they're going to come back for the wedding night. And the nurse says to Juliet, "Hie you to church. I must another way, to fetch a ladder by the which your love must climb a bird's nest soon when it is dark. I am the drudge and toil in your delight." Right? So she says, yeah, you know, you go, you get married, you have a great time. I have to find like a rope ladder that's going to work, and you know, make all this possible. And you know, this is what's left for me, is to try to bring, you know, joy to the next people. So I think that's a significant thing that Shakespeare is attempting to do. And I think the exception, by the way, is Lord Capulet, who gets involved in trying to make all these arrangements work. And I think he's a more sympathetic character than people have ever recognized. So I'm going to wear, I have a button, if I remember to wear it, I'll wear on time, which just says Team Capulet on it. I got it from strange circumstances. Anyway, Shakespeare's on both sides of this, right? He's not exactly in the middle, but he's here and he's here, right? And somehow both of them seem to be true. This is what the poet John Keats said in a letter to his brother. It is the true mark of a great artistic genius, and he says that Shakespeare is, you know, the supreme example of what he calls negative capability, which I'm going to put this very slightly wrong, is the ability to be in doubts, anxieties, and uncertainties without any irritable grasping after fact or reason. You know, the ability just to say, okay, I'm here, and I'm here. In fact, I deliberately costumed today, like light and dark. You can get gray, right? You're taking the gray, it's different, right? It just depends. Am I wearing a white shirt or a blue shirt? You don't know, right? It's not the most elaborate costume I've ever worn, but it'll have to do for the moment. So Shakespeare wants you to know that, yes, the romantic dance is going on there between Romeo and Juliet, and it's beautiful, but servants have had to set things up. Even Romeo's deeply romantic suicide is made possible by what? How does Romeo kill himself?
He buys
Yeah.
the poison from the guy in the
Good. He buys the poison from this guy, an apothecary. This is basically a pharmacist kind of guy. Right. So he has to do that. And again, Shakespeare doesn't have to show that, right? Shakespeare says, oh, Romeo, I'm Romeo. Oh, it's a heartbreak. Unfortunately, I have a poison here, and I fear not to use it, right? Doesn't do that. And how does he get the apothecary to sell him this thing? What's the problem? The apothecary says, no, there's a death penalty for me distributing this stuff. I'm supposed to be able to control the medicines. I can't give you a whole bottle of this stuff. Remember what Romeo says to him? He says, look, you're poor, you're starving, you're miserable. Give me the stuff, I'll give you money. Don't ask a lot of questions. You've got nothing else to live for. Take it. And he does, right? He sort of basically squeezes this guy into doing it. Shakespeare doesn't need to show us that either, but it's another moment where, you know, Romeo's whole romantic story kind of hinges on the fact that the poor apothecary is starving to death. Yeah.
But then he goes around and says, well, actually, the gold is the poison, not the poison. So it's like undermining his own argument.
Yeah, well, he's trying to say, yes, you know, he gets grandly moralistic, as Romeo unfortunately has a way of doing at moments, right? And says, yes, I've given you poison by giving you money, you haven't given me, you know, sure, right, but he certainly has no problem in sort of accepting, you know, living in the grand family palace of the place. Good point, yeah, good memory on that. That's great. Did anybody ever see Nicholas Nickleby? The Dickens novel is a great TV version of a great 7-hour performance of it. There's a character who plays the apothecary. It's beautiful. Anyway, all right. So this is an old debate, right? It's been around, it goes back certainly as far as the ancient Greeks. It's there in, various visionary futures of Star Trek episodes and so on. Should there be this social inequality, this class system? Should there be, manual laborers, and they're separate from people who get to do stuff like, come in and talk about Shakespeare or whatever else other things people get to do. And it's a problem, right? It's not exactly clear. You certainly can say we've got extraordinary income inequality, it's obviously wrong, it desperately needs to change, and so on. On the other hand, you probably also say, well, my cousin is getting cancer treatment over at UCLA, and I don't want, the best cancer specialist in the world to have to get up every morning and mine some coal beneath their house and then go out and try to harvest their wheat and then so on, so, right? You say, okay, we can have certain differentiated roles. It's obviously an irresolvable debate and one desperately that needs resolution. But it seems to me that this kind of balance is another part of that Shakespearean quality of debate, which is also a quality of Elizabethan education. That is, education in Shakespeare's time. So a lot of what they would do, rhetoric was a huge topic, right? Humanism was teaching you how to use language. It was thought to be a really important thing to do, not that you would believe certain long-term budget plans of universities, but that you could control your life, you could lead, you could help people, you could take all kinds of advantages, privileges, and pleasures if you could use language better than other people use language. And Shakespeare sort of over a long time has come to show that there's something to that. But what they would do, let's see, they would have debates in Tramquay Partum, I think I've got that right. If not, blame the head injury. That is on either side of the question. So you would be told, you're going to argue that bees are better than bears, and you're going to argue that bears are better than bees, okay? And then maybe you do it, and then you'd actually switch and have to argue the other person. So it was like debating society. And you could see that an education built around a lot of that would help produce somebody a little bit like Shakespeare, even though nobody could be completely like Shakespeare. That people are taught to have to think about what it looks like from the other side, which is something, the opposite of which gets lamented in a lot of political debates in the country even now. And so sort of what I feel like I'm trying to build up to is the idea that maybe the ending of this play is two opposite endings, light and dark. How do we go about figuring out whether this is a play about death, defeat, tragedy, or this is a play about the possibilities, the infinite possibilities of life? I'll say some more about that again on Tuesday. But a lot of it depends on whether you come to the play with a pretty good, down-to-earth, pragmatic view of how to live, or whether you come with a somewhat out-of-control, romantic view of what life ought to be for. Because you probably can find, as so often in Shakespeare's plays, an affirmation for what you want to believe in the play if you're ready to look at it. So, do we end up with a story about transcendence because of love, or do we get a story about mere endurance as a viable purpose of life? Certainly, Grimm, any pragmatic view, in fact, of the lovers say they failed, right? They tried to do this, they tried to have this wonderful relationship, but they've actually in the process destroyed themselves and at least let the world destroy them. And again, that's the moral of the kind of the Arthur Brooke Romeos and Juliet poem. It's pretty much like that. It's very sort of scoldy about these young lovers letting themselves get carried away. It's as if instead of Shakespeare, kind of your middle school principle for discipline was like writing a play that should be presented to all the young adolescents so they don't make any of these awful mistakes of not obeying their parents and all that kind of stuff. And in fact, it's kind of there in the voice of the chorus. I said at the beginning of the play, the chorus says this is terrible and this is tragic, and it ends badly. But I think one of the things that's happening is by 1594, having a chorus in the play was already kind of an old-fashioned device. It was in a lot of older plays. It's there obviously very heavily in the ancient Greek and Roman tragedies, Greek particularly. And I think it may be that the chorus has a kind of old-fashioned moral to offer. Did you read in Tene, Dr. Faustus? Right? It's there kind of, isn't it? You know, you got the play, and you know, the chorus, they're gonna give you a big moral to it that looks very conventional. But if you're actually experiencing the play, you start saying, wait a minute, that's not the only way to see this, right? On behalf of Faustus. The conventional morality doesn't carry that same kind of weight. So, yeah, you can argue, I suppose, that Romeo and Juliet make peace in their city between their families, but that's not probably quite good enough, right? You don't want Prince Charming to disappear into, you know, the grave so he can be reborn as, you know, undersecretary for Serbian resolutions. I don't know. You know, somebody, I'm not criticizing the work of diplomats, important, probably should be done more, but it's a different way of trying to manage the world. So it seems to me you're going to be looking for something else, and I think Shakespeare gives us a few dreamy little hints to hold on to about this. Let me pause here for a moment. Anybody have observations, questions? Yeah.
I just think that one of the things that redeems this play for me, because it's not my favorite, is that if you like move any of those supporting characters like one square in any direction, then Romeo and Juliet live and they escape together and they live happily ever after. And I think that's kind of the point also, is that had, you know, the king and the ruler like listened to the pleas and the story of how Mercutio died and how Tybalt died and what had happened, and been any kind of logical person and not just fed up with these two families, then there would have been, you know, no cause for Romeo to disappear in the first place. Or if her mother had listened to her and said, I don't want to marry her. Or if the nurse had said, oh, okay, tell your mother you're marrying her, and I'll hide you, and you escape down the ladder yourself and go find him and run off
so many
and
missed
live and be
opportunities.
happy. Like any one of these things could have changed it. And I think that's kind of the beauty of it as well, is that it wasn't just on them, and they're so young, like, they're so excited, but they also don't know how anything works either, and these other people could have just guided them in a different way.
Yeah, there was a, I don't know why I was seeing a Twitter feed about arguing about Romeo and Juliet. I was just saying. So why don't people realize these are wonderful kids? The grown-ups failed them. And they did that every period, single period, time period. And that's true, but it's also not true, right? I mean, because you say, oh, gosh, does Romeo realize how worried his father is about him? One of those first scenes of the play. Could he talk to somebody about any of this? He doesn't. Juliet, is afraid to talk to her father, and I want to argue if she talked to her father, it probably could have worked out. Mercutio, Mercutio gets carried away, Tybalt gets carried away. The young people do plenty of bad things themselves, right? But you're absolutely right. That's part of what makes this play so interesting and tantalizing, is there are all these other possibilities that are hinted at, and ways that this could still have worked out. So it's not like it couldn't possibly have happened, and just tragically, it's like, literature's always kind of been our great access to a sort of string theory view. Like, this could have been this story, this could have, and for us, right, we read it, we're growing up, we think, okay, now I think, this story could go this way. I think I better figure out how to get it to go this way. I remember my younger child was, he was like in 6th grade or something. And he started deciding when to hang out with the cool kids, and all of a sudden, he was getting kind of mean about the other nerdier kids and everything like that. I remember his sister was going to say, haven't you watched any of these movies? Do you understand which person you're being now in this movie? And we do, right? We sort of navigate by these guidelines. And anyway, I'm going to talk a lot about that. So yes, all these possibilities are here, and Shakespeare makes sure not just that the conceptual and philosophical possibilities are there, but also that the narrative lines, the storylines of the action, look at every moment as if maybe something could veer off. And it doesn't, but I think he still somehow keeps a certain level of suspense in the air. So that's sort of what I want to go and talk about. Yes?
In their death too, I think that, like, looking at this, at least the first time that I read it, I thought, okay, well, that's the end of it for them, and they ended everything through that. But there is kind of relief in that, because I think there's a religious connotation and aspect to what they did, where, like, if they are religious, which it kind of seems like they are,
certainly that's what they're.
that they believe in afterlife, right? So maybe
Mhm.
they can be together in a place where nobody will interfere with their love, and they don't have to deal with all of these things that everybody else is kind of making them deal with if they're together in death, I guess. And
Yeah.
the family comes together at the end too, so it's kind of like
Yeah.
they kind of got everything they wanted in a way if
Uh-huh.
you look at it from
Yeah.
that.
And their love never had to rust and all that kind of stuff. Okay, good, yeah. That's sort of the line I want to try to push a little bit, is this resurrection, even if it's not strictly religious resurrection in a purely familiar Christian model of afterlife. I think that, I mean, I saw a student production of Romeo and Juliet some years back. And at the end, they're in the tomb, right? But the tomb, the curtain goes up on the tomb. And it's a set of like great seats, just like the ones we were sitting in the audience. And there are various bodies in various states of decay lying around, turning various green or bony or whatever else it is they're turning there, and Tybalt's still kind of bloody over here. And Romeo and Juliet, are playing out their last scene. It was an interesting production, probably because it wasn't romantic at all. It was very chilly. Like you felt you were in one of those drafty, cold stone castles or something, because nobody's connecting to anybody, right? Nobody knows if Romeo knew this, if Juliet knew this, if Friar knew this, if the message had gotten through, if she told him, if that. Everybody's kind of running by each other, right? Romeo won't even tell, his buddy Benvolio exactly what's wrong with him any more than he will tell his father. Everybody's missing each other. And all that context does make you yearn for a place. I think it highlights when Romeo and Juliet, how connected they are, right? This moment makes you treasure this moment where two people are absolutely, pouring themselves out to each other. But part of what it made me think was, you got this tomb, you say, okay, there's Romeo and Juliet, they're both, about to die. But all the people sitting up in the seats are dead, right? And all the people sitting up in our seats are going to be dead, and Romeo and Juliet are going to keep popping back up, as they do on stages all over the world, probably about 14 times a day, every day for 400 years, precisely because of the way that they died for their love, that they absolutely gave everything to each other. So it was this feeling like, wait a minute, from one perspective, yes, these young people are so sad, they wasted their lives, what did their lives ever mean? They could have, and then on the other hand, you say, well, yeah, even if it's not, floating around with wings in heaven, there is, and I think Shakespeare tries to give us some dreamy hints that this is possible. Because you hear more in this play about dreams than you would in the afternoon of a, sort of conventional psychotherapist or somebody, right? You keep hearing from people about this. And I think I have enough time to track a little bit of this. Romeo talks a lot about, he has a lot of Petrarchan love talk he does, and they make fun of him, right? He's told, I love did read by rote that could not spell, right? You knew how to echo all the popular love periods of the poems of the period. Now it would probably be love songs of the period. But you don't really understand what they mean. You're just kind of playing, singing along. Why did I bring that up? Right, so Romeo, Petrarchan love stuff, you probably may remember from English 10A, is all about conflicting things, fiery ice and living death and hot cold and sick health. And Romeo has that long speech with all that stuff where he keeps talking about them. And one of the items, last item he has on that is still waking sleep that is not what it is. And I think the last part of this play becomes very dreamlike and puts us in this kind of position of not quite knowing what's real and what's a dream. When the Montagues are arriving for the party, Romeo sort of says, I'm not sure we should do this, I sort of had a bad dream about it, right? And Mercutio makes fun of him for this, it's a silly, sentimental kind of thing. And Mercutio says, yes, I dreamt a dream too. And Romeo says, well, dreamers often lie. And Romeo says, yes, in bed asleep where they dream things true. And I think maybe the play supports Romeo's position better than it supports Mercutio's position. Dreams do seem to have a tendency to come true in the play, not just, the results of yesterday's late night pepperoni pizzas. So there's a lot of places in the play where reality starts seeming like a dream. I talked about that, wandering out in the night or wandering out on your balcony after a beautiful night of candlelit dancing and drinking, and suddenly discover the person you fell insanely in love with a moment and only had a moment together with is speaking out into the night your name as my eternal love, or is suddenly answering when you do that from the balcony below you and swearing that person's eternal love for you. But toward the end of the play, I'm not sure anybody, including us, is allowed to figure out what's real and what is just a dream. When Romeo is standing just outside the tomb in the dark, he asks himself a question. I put this number 10 here on your handout. Romeo says, "What said my man as his servant? What said my man when my betossed soul did not attend him as we rode? I think he told me Paris should have married Juliet. Said he not so, or did I dream it so?" Well, we don't know, right? We didn't see the conversation, so we don't really know whether, for sure, yes, he was told this, or he had a dream that told him the truth about this. And later in the scene, after Romeo has killed Paris, actually, let's take a respectful pause for a moment and think about Count Paris, about his version of the story. I mean, here he is, right? He's a nice, handsome, well-behaved, successful person, young man. Shows up, he hears there's a lovely young woman from an aristocratic family in Venice who's coming to marriageable age, and he comes to court her, and he's very polite, he's very good with her parents. And yet every time he walks down the room, she breaks into tears and runs away, right? And I think I put one on the handout here for you, number 13. And if you can only hear what she says about him behind his back, right? "Oh, bid me leap rather than marry Paris from off the battlements of any tower, or walk in thievish ways, or bid me lurk where serpents are, chain me with roaring bears, or hide me nightly in a charnel house, or covered quite with dead man's rattling bones, with reeky shanks and yellow chapless skulls." Nice, right? This is always what I thought when I called somebody and said, "Oh, I can't Thursday." Yeah, really, that's what she said, right? So, Paris. So he does this, but he's patient, right? He goes through, he stays with it, he understands, he negotiates, he does everything perfectly good, and then she's miserable with this terrible guy named Romeo, kills her cousin, and now she's so sad she doesn't want to get married, and explain that to him, and then she gets so much sadder that she dies. Oh my God, and he's nice about it, right? He shows up for the wedding, he's got his little ruffled tuxedo and everything like that. And they say, "Oh, good morning." She's dead. Okay, and he's being nice about that, right? He goes that night, brings flowers to her tomb. What a nice thing to do. And then who does he see? With a crowbar, Romeo, the villain of the story. This terrible man. And what's he going to do? There are things that Romeo says that make you think there's going to be another kind of terrible necrophiliac act. He's going to break into the tomb where Juliet's buried. Not on my watch, right? Forbear, villain. It's supposed to work, right? And Romeo says, no, you don't understand. Look, there's a lot behind this story. Please leave me alone. I got enough troubles. I'm not going to do anything. Please, just stop. No, I don't. Fight. He's dead. And never has any idea what hit him, right? Never had any idea what this story was possibly about. So I think you got to, just accept that there's that. So, talking about being sort of minor characters and all the minor characters play is sort of joke about because they're minor characters, but, that's sort of the burden of being a minor character. And the question sort of is, aren't Romeo and Juliet the main characters of a certain world that we want to believe in? Anyway. All right. So, Balthazar number 7, and number 11 says, "As I did sleep under the yew tree here, I dreamt my master in another thought, and my master slew him." Well, do we know that? We don't know whether Balthazar dreamed that, because remember, it's the middle of the night. He said he was going to go off and hide somewhere and lie down in the dark. Or whether he saw it and thought he was dreaming. Which one? The whole graveyard scene is very dark and nightmarish. He's gone off. Benvolio, in fact, Balthazar is left vague whether he's going to decide to spy on Romeo or just take a rest. And we're certainly way too busy watching the confrontation between Romeo and Paris to be watching, whether Balthazar is asleep or awake over there in the dark corner of the stage. So it's another place where we don't quite know, but it looks like it's, exactly, we need to know that we don't quite know. And Shakespeare sets up these ambiguities with a hint of salvation, because just before Balthazar brings in the news of Juliet's death, Romeo opens Act 5 with a narration of an oddly optimistic dream. This is going to be, sorry, 12. Romeo says, this is, he's on his way to try to be reunited with Juliet. If I may trust the flattering truth of sleep, my dreams presage some joyful news at hand. My bosom's lord, that's his heart, sits lightly in his throne, and all this day an unaccustomed spirit lifts me above the ground with cheerful thoughts. I dreamt my lady came and found me dead. A strange dream that gives a dead man leave to think, and breathes such life with kisses in my lips that I revived and was an emperor. Well, again, a pragmatist will look at this and say, oh man, he's so romantically deluded. He thinks there's good news coming, and in fact, it's terrible news that's coming. The news is that Juliet, is gone, right? And he doesn't seem to wake up when Juliet kisses him, right? Because he's dead. So what do we make of this? And yet, on the other hand, he's right. Because he is going to be lying there, and Juliet is going to come and kiss him on his dead lips. And if he's right about that, who's to say he's not partly maybe right about the rest of it? Maybe there is some kind of a magical revival, outside, beyond the view of our kind of ordinary eyes, back the vanishing point out the back of the stage, where they do, because it's odd, it's eerie how well he at least anticipates the part of it that we see. And Shakespeare kind of provokes us, right? Strange dream that gives a dead man leave. Like, wow, it's sort of dead. I was dead but not dead, right? Because if I was dead, I wouldn't be. He's provoking us at least to think about that kind of odd little middle territory. So you can say, yeah, he's a tragic character thinking he's in a comedy at this moment, but I want to keep showing the reverse possibility. So is this a play, a comedy therefore, where love marriage defeats death, rather than death defeating love and marriage, which would be the tragic outcome? It seems to me, again, I don't have to answer the question because you kind of answer it for yourself when you watch the play and you feel one way or another about the sort of magnificence of this love affair, and on the one hand as transcending all these seeming practical realities of the world, or something else. So, while I'm old enough to see this is basically a pretty sad story about love defeated, I kind of have this feeling that maybe they just slipped out of view from us at that point. That somehow they do seem to have a certain kind of immortality that's going on. Amor vicit omnia, right? Love conquers all. In fact, the difference between what Romeo says he's willing to put up with, which is, you remember I quoted it before, we were talking to the friar. He says, "Let love devouring death do what he will, it is enough I make but call her mine." Love devouring death. What's the difference between love devouring death and, take out the hyphen, and it's love devouring death? And Juliet talks about it.
As to make a difference, like explain what it is, like it's like love devouring, like it's like death that's like caused by like the malice love, and like love devouring death is just like love conquering death.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And remember, Juliet talks about her love with him, her fatal love for him, as being in death's dateless night. Well, if it's dateless, there's a whole. When she gives her speech, we'll go back and look at this speech, I think, next time and time after. But when she's having a gallop apace speech, it sounds like she's almost anticipating the death, but she's also anticipating a certain kind of transcendence that comes with it. So, in fact, even before anticipating the first amorous embrace, Juliet says she prays that eyes may wink, and Romeo leap to these arms untalked of and unseen. So it just means, what nobody will see us and so on. But what if our eyes are winking, right? And Romeo comes back into her arms unseen. I think that there's at least some possibilities floating around here. So, Juliet says that, their love's going to come to what she calls a timeless end. Does that mean it's infinite death? Or does that mean it's something that exists in some ways as this love story has existed outside of time? So, there's lots of thrilling and awful things about being an adolescent, right? And some of them are these fantastic possibilities, and some of them are these sort of dreadful futilities. And I think Shakespeare does a kind of amazing job of keeping all those possibilities in suspense. This is a very tricky kind of love story. When the people in this play are trying to connect to each other and failing to connect, I think we have a great possibility that's out there. Romeo is full of love dreams. And everybody, again, nobody's connected to anybody otherwise, right? The wedding that one person wants more than anything, Paris, is the person the love that wedding that one person wants anything else instead of, in the position of Juliet. The children don't understand the parents don't understand the children. The friar has this letter that's crucial, but the person who's delivering the letter doesn't probably quite know how crucial the timing is of that letter. And in fact, Romeo doesn't even know that Juliet's alive. There's all these kind of epistemological failures in the play that carry the love story in ways that make us feel like desperate with our own knowledge to fill in for them. But there's lots of other possibilities we can fill in. So, what I wanted to try to capture about Romeo and Juliet is that at moments it's possible to think we have seen, or at least we have dreamed, some ultimate fulfillment of what people hope out of, perfect love, right? The way that is supposed to offer you something beyond whatever the conventional, pragmatic concerns of the world are bringing to you as a possibility, or telling you are the only possibilities. I used to run a summer program in Washington, D.C. for school teachers, secondary school teachers around the country to try to help people, get some fresh new feelings about Shakespeare and new ways of teaching and so on. But we're working on Romeo and Juliet because obviously that gets taught a lot. But I had one teacher say, no, I'm never teaching that again. And it's because she had had a student couple commit, suicide together after she had taught the play. And so I want to say, it's a dangerous thing, right? It's a dangerous thing to think, there's nothing between your perfect love and, death, that anything else is death. So, it's a scarily powerful play. There's a reason why it stuck around for this long. But I don't think we necessarily have to give up the romantic reading of the play to say that we're serious readers of the play. I think that there's all kinds of ways, and I'm going to talk about one more of them next time. Maybe I can get a start on it today. Because I've been hinting about Lord Capulet. And I put this on the handout in case we had time to get to it. All right. So we have that line that you quoted to us before, in number 14, right, where the prince is asked. The prince is kind of saying, maybe we can work this out. Maybe this is just where you can stop the feud now. Prince says, Romeo slew him, that is Tybalt. He slew Mercutio. Who know the price of his dear blood doth fill? And Lord Montague, Romeo's father that is, says, not Romeo, Prince. He was Mercutio's friend. His fault concludes but what the law should end, the life of Tybalt. Right? So Romeo's father steps in and says, Romeo shouldn't be punished as a murderer when all he did was just kind of even this up and kill somebody who was deserving the death penalty anyway because they had just killed somebody. So if you look, anybody have an edition of the play you're looking at? I already know because I've looked at pretty much every edition of the play except the 1963 Signet paperback edition. Virtually every edition, I've gone back through history, through hundreds of years, and the most famous editions of the plays by Dr. Samuel Johnson, and all the ones, and the Cambridge edition, the Oxford edition, the Royal Shakespeare Company edition, the Arden edition, all of these editions of the play, the Folger edition I believe I see over there, any version of the play you look, that, as of course it should be, is Lord Montague, right? Because he's Romeo's father. The only person who does not agree about it, and I've never seen, well, I've seen it perform once now, but I'll tell you that's a story next time. The only person who really doesn't agree with that was a guy named William Shakespeare. Because if you look at the first printings of this play, well, the first quarter of the play is a complete mess. It doesn't have this speech in it at all. But the second quarto, which is the best text, and the first folio, the alternative best text, both of them have, I put here, you can sort of see one of these. Maybe kind of, I know I printed a little bit too dark. Who slew him? He slew Mercutio. Romeo slew him, he slew Mercutio. Now the price of his drip left no. Capu says, not Romeo, Prince, who was Mercutio's friend, his life. Capulet. It's Capu there, it's Cap in the other early edition. So everybody, and the Oxford edition says this is an obvious mistake, so we just correct it. Clearly a mistake, it says, I think, in the Arden edition. I don't think so. I think it's Capulet who says that. Yes, of course. If you think, it's so obvious, there's a feud, the family hates each other, and everybody's bad, and so on, then of course it's Romeo's father's only going to defend Romeo. But if you look at some of the other things Capulet says leading up to this, and the circumstances in which Capulet is, and what Capulet's experience with Tybalt has been, and what Capulet seems to do, including inviting the whole Montagues to the party and trying to get them to stay for dinner. When Tybalt wants to attack Romeo, he says, no, Romeo's a wonderful guy. I hear great things about him. I really want him to be here in my house. Don't you think the other possibility, again, I'm sort of, like taking that contrary position about the adults a little bit here. Isn't it possible that Capulet would have said yes if Juliet had said Romeo wants to marry me? So here's another one of these possibilities in the play that, good commonsensical editors trying to make everything make sense have taken out. It makes every kind of sense except Shakespearean sense for that to be Lord Montague, Romeo's father. And what would that matter? What would that change for you? Well, yeah, as you think about it, right? What if? What if this is another of the what ifs that we've been talking about? So I was working with, I was going up to take my kid up to college up in Portland, Oregon. And they had an original practices Shakespeare competition that I put on Romeo and Juliet. And I contacted the director and said, look, I've written a certain amount about this. I really think there's only, and you're the original practice Shakespeare. I'm trying to do everything right with the players having scrolls and all this stuff the way it was done originally. Don't you want to do the original text? And so I got them to do it. I have like a 12-second video clip or something. So it's the first time at the beginning, because if I can get the world to see something in Romeo and Juliet that really makes the play more interesting, it's going to be more important than anything else pretty much I've ever accomplished in my professional life. So when I sort of said, it's one of the ways, I said you're going to get different Romeo and Juliet. That's why I think this is a different Romeo and Juliet, because I think there's a whole other story, one more story that's lurking there that makes total sense when you think about actually what else we hear from what's happened. So I'm going to talk about that at the beginning next time, and then I want to do some close reading kind of stuff, because I want to talk about why I think everybody misses this point. I think Shakespeare gives you a lot of ways that he causes you to think about binary oppositions in the play and to think that there's no way out of them. And you really have to squint your eyes to recognize that other possibility that I was trying to push here at the end of the day. Any last thoughts or questions about that? All right. It's a pleasure working with you again. I will see you here again on Tuesday for more Romeo and Juliet.